Hello, and welcome to another episode of Enchanting Economics in New Mexico. This podcast is a production of Bieber, the recognized expert in socioeconomic data for the state of New Mexico. I'm your host, Rayanne McKernan, and today we're going to talk about higher education enrollment. It's probably not a statistic that you would think of often when thinking of state economics, but we have an expert here who is going to show us how it actually does play a role in our economy. Joining us is Dr. Jim Peach. He is a Regents Professor at New Mexico State University in the Department of Economics and International Business. Did I get that right?
Yes, but I'm emeritus. I retired 2 years ago.
Emeritus, sorry. Okay. You're still active to me, so you know.
Yes.
Dr. Peach, I had the pleasure of listening to you speak to the State Council of University Presidents a few weeks ago. And one of the topics you touched on was enrollment. And you mentioned that you had been tracking it for some time. How did you get into following collegiate enrollment? And do you look at only New Mexico State? Do you keep a general eye on all of state university enrollments?
I got into this many, many decades ago in the late 70s when I was part of a team in Austin, Texas that prepared enrollment projections for the Texas State College Coordinating Board. And we made projections of all of the universities in Texas. And since then, I've kept up with it. I've made projections for NMSU for a long, long time. I don't do that anymore since I retired a couple of years ago. And I take a look at the other universities as well.
So the reason I wanted to talk about higher ed enrollments with you is there's a few reasons. But one is I was having a conversation with a coworker of mine a few weeks ago, and she mentioned that there's a general sense of a correlation between the status of our economy and the enrollment at higher education institutions. So I'm wondering, have you seen any parallel between the two?
Yes, and it's not just in New Mexico. Generally speaking, college enrollments are very frequently counter-cyclical. And what I mean by that is that when the economy turns bad, enrollments go up. When the job market is really, really good, enrollments often turn down. In fact, in the Great Recession, the worst part of the Great Recession for New Mexico was 2010 and 2011. And most of the universities in the state had a peak enrollment back then in 2010 and 2011. That's not the whole story, of course.
Oh, okay. Well, keep going. Tell more.
Well, New Mexico in particular faces a huge demographic problem. Since 2010, we've had the slowest rate of population growth, according to the Census Bureau estimates, since we had in the 1960s. And in particular, young people ages 18 to 24, which is a prime kind of group for college enrollment, has been shrinking. And so we've got a demographic problem, and we now have an economic problem. The COVID crisis, of course, is a complicated thing. Some students may be frightened to go back to school, but the labor market is so terrible that there may be a positive effect there. I know at NMSU, the President Thoros, thinks that we'll be within 1% plus or minus of where we were last year.
Interesting. So, looking at our current economic situation with COVID-19, do you feel that our state institutions should expect that, or do you think those are unreasonable expectations? One of the things I think of is, if enrollment in an elementary school drops, then they lose funding. I can't even grasp how this affects higher ed.
Well, like I said, there are likely to be two effects. One is that people may be afraid to go back to school. And the other is that the job market is so bad that we may see a boost in enrollment in a lot of places. Yeah, New Mexico has, last year, we had about 121,000 students enrolled in public colleges in the state. That's down from about 155,000 in the fall of 2010. So we've lost more than 20% of enrollment. And I think most of that is due to the demography that I was just talking about. You mentioned the K through 12 and how they get their funding. There is a formula, of course, for higher ed funding, but that's really, to me, it's an allocation formula. The legislature decides how much money they want to put up, and then it's the formula is used to allocate that between the universities. So, but it's a big deal. Education in general is a big deal. If you add up pre-K through 12 plus higher ed, we've got 450,000 students in the state. That's more than 20% of the state's population. Anything that affects 20% of the state's population is a big economic event.
Do they have to be more worried about their funding because of COVID or no?
I think the worry on the state, on state funding, I think the worry is the overall state budget, and not in particular what we see for enrollment this fall. The whole state budget is in question. We just had a special session that cut some money, and most universities got a 4 to 6% cut on what's called instruction and general funding. And that's a lot of the funding in the state for higher ed. It's in January, it's going to be a really tough legislative session, and the universities could see some additional cuts.
So let's look a little more in depth at some of the institutions here in New Mexico. And I'm not sure if you will be able to answer these questions or not, but let's give it a try. I was hoping that you would be able to enlighten us on some of the key differences or concerns for higher ed institutions in our state. For example, is location a factor that will affect their enrollment moving forward? You know, in Hobbs, they have the University of the Southwest and they have New Mexico Junior College. Are these universities looking at harder times ahead because that area is seeing a drop in oil and gas? Or are they set for an increase in enrollment because of the changing times?
That's a really good question and a hard one to answer. The only thing that we can go on is what happened during the Great Recession. And during the Great Recession, both of those institutions did fairly well. They had increases in enrollment. I don't know what's going to happen this fall, but like the other institutions in the state, they've generally been following a downward trend for a number of years. If we didn't have the COVID crisis right now, you could expect modest declines in both of those places, as well as NMSU Carlsbad, which is in that part of the world as well.
And then is there a difference between public versus private? You know, I know in other parts of the country, especially like New York, which is where I grew up, there are a lot more private institutions than there are public state institutions. Is anyone expecting to suffer more because of the current downturn, or is everyone just in trouble?
I think everyone is in trouble. But the private schools, of course, have, unless they have a large endowment, which is not the case in New Mexico, they've got to worry about how many people show up and how much tuition is paid, and they've got to cover their costs. But nationwide, that's a huge issue. When COVID first got into the news and people were starting to talk about educational issues in the Chronicle of Higher Education and inside higher ed, there were people predicting 20 to 30% declines in enrollment in the fall. And I don't think that's going to happen, even with a number of universities nationwide going all online. I think the nature of it has changed so much. Let me use NMSU as an example here. NMSU started classes today, and some of them are face-to-face. But if I heard the president correctly the other day, only 9% of our classes are fully face-to-face. The rest are either fully online or some sort of hybrid model where people show up sometimes. And that's a different game. If you think about attracting students as a marketing strategy, and some of it is, we're marketing a different product now than we used to.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, because my age group, I'm, in the 30 to 40 range.
Lucky you.
But growing up, it was always like, you go to school, you graduate, you go to college, you graduate. It was always a standard experience. And it wasn't like, most everyone went away, stayed in the dorms, had that whole college experience. I can't help but wonder what that means going forward. Like, I feel for the kids that are starting their freshman years, like, is there a chance that is there a greater chance that those kids starting as freshmen won't finish because they're not getting that experience that draws you in,
That's been a national discussion. And if you look at any of the major news networks, almost every day you can see some university president or some university official discussing what they think is going to happen. And no one has a good handle on what the long-term effects of this are going to be. Will students get used to the idea of doing most things remotely? I think that would be a terrible loss. I've taught online, I've taught face-to-face. I think there's online, no matter how good it is generally second best to face-to-face. There's nothing like having interaction with the students. And then the students need to interact with each other.
Right.
And this is a different world we're living in. We don't know how this is going to come out. Part of it will be how successful universities in New Mexico and elsewhere are in pulling off a fall semester that is at least substantially done remotely. Yeah. We're going to have students here on campus, but not nearly as many as we did before. And what do you get from that? UNM and NMSU have already canceled sporting events for the fall, and that kind of thing and social interaction, that's a really big deal as a motivator to go to college. I don't know how this is going to come out, and I don't think anyone else does.
Yeah. I read somewhere that you were kind of an expert in sports economics as well. I'm wondering if you still follow that, and if you do, specifically looking at New Mexico and New Mexico State, what does that mean for them economically, losing football this fall?
I can tell you specifically with regard to NMSU, and I can speculate a little bit on UNM. NMSU had 2 so-called money games in their football season this year. Those would have paid out $2.7 million to the university. Plus, we usually get $600,000 or $700,000 in ticket sales, and then there's some other minor revenue from playing football. So it's about a $3 million hit. We'll save a little bit of money from reduce travel costs, but that certainly won't offset the loss.
Right.
That's out of a budget that, depending on how you look at it, is about $20 million. UNM is a little bit larger than that, and will take a substantially larger hit financially from it. It's a serious thing because the universities don't have any spare cash around to hand out to the athletics departments.
Yeah.
And it's happening nationwide.
Yeah. Well, I saw, I think it was Washington maybe, wound up cutting some sports. Stanford, I'm pretty sure, just cut a bunch of sports.
Right.
I'm wondering if our state's athletic programs need to worry. Like, without those big money games, are Olympic sports in trouble at these universities? Like, because like you said, if there's no funding.
That depends, and that, again, that's being faced nationwide. But for NMSU and for UNM to remain in NCAA Division I, we have to have 16 teams. NMSU cut out equestrian a few years ago. UNM cut out a couple of things as well. But we're pretty much at the minimum if we want to continue to play the game at all. Yeah. The NCAA requires 16 sports, and there's no sign that they're going to change that. They're going to loosen up on a lot of things, especially eligibility for players who lose a season because of this crisis. There are discussions on that. They're already talking about an extra year of eligibility. That will happen. But unless they change the rule on the number of sports that you have to remain in the NCAA, we're pretty much stuck.
Yeah. I'm also curious too, like with athletics, there's such a passion, not only for the Aggies, but also for the Lobos. I mean,
yes.
There are other institutions in the state, but pretty much, everyone's either an Aggie or a Lobo. Like, you have your loyalties.
Yes.
And I feel like that rivalry, that passion, it supports more than just athletics. I'm thinking of all of the merchandise that is made and produced locally. Like, there are other ramifications, I think, that maybe aren't normally thought of. Is there something besides, just merchandise that you can think of that could really affect our state by possibly losing sports or just losing that momentum, losing that passion, losing that engagement?
Sure, and that passion means that there are students who are going to those two institutions right now whose parents and grandparents went to the same place.
Yeah.
And it's a sense of loyalty that gets developed, and really that passion for a school, it's a complicated kind of thing. When surveys are done of incoming freshmen, NMSU did this a few years ago, sports are not listed as one of the top reasons why they go to a place. But certainly, if you look at big schools like Alabama's enrollment has just boomed, and they're now to the point where more than half of the people who go to the University of Alabama are from out of state.
Right.
And that's true at a lot of big time schools. And so, athletic success like that really is important. You mentioned sales of merchandise and the like. Yes, a lot of it is sold locally, but very little of it is produced locally.
Gotcha. What about the food industry? Will they see a hit with not having college events? I'm thinking in Albuquerque, we've got Saggio's. That's one of the big places that everyone hits prior to any sort of game, whether it's football or an Olympic sport. I would imagine there are places down in Las Cruces that are very tied to Aggie athletics. Do you see a hit in that industry at all?
Yes, but more generally and they've already been hit, more generally because classes have been online.
Right.
There are very few restaurants and bars that can survive on 6 football games a year or 12 or 15 basketball games.
Yeah.
You've got to make money year round, and they all know that during the summertime they take a hit. But they took a hit last spring when we went online, and when restaurants were shut down for a while, and they've still got restrictions. The restaurant and hotel industry as well, they're really hurting in New Mexico, and that's big time business.
Yeah. Is there any other industry that you can think of that would definitely feel an effect because of a lack of enrollment in higher ed?
Well, in both Albuquerque, they're different, but in both Albuquerque and in Las Cruces, there are a lot of apartment complexes that depend on students renting apartments. And fewer students, fewer rentals, those people are going to be hurting a little bit. There's not really much of anything to replace that. They were designed for students.
Yeah.
And certainly, you look up and down University Avenue in Las Cruces, or look at Nob Hill or Central in Albuquerque, and an awful lot of the traffic of those retail shops and restaurants and bars is university related.
Yeah.
Not all of it, but a lot.
Right. Do you think that a community that doesn't support one of these big institutions like UNM or New Mexico State, let's say like the Farmington area, they have San Juan College. Is there anything else higher ed wise up there? Are they more immune? I don't know if immune is the right word, but are they in a better situation economically if higher ed takes a decline?
They probably won't be hurt as much. San Juan College is a nice place. I've been up there twice in the last year for one event or another. There are not dozens and dozens of businesses that surround the campus. That's just not the nature of that place. The sad thing about that region, about Farmington and actually the whole county, is that they've been in trouble for years because natural gas prices are so low. They're just really hurting, and now that the coal-fired generating plants are closing and the coal mines are closing, Farmington has been in trouble for quite some time. This won't help anything. They might actually get a little bit of a boost in enrollment out of this.
Well, hopefully, if it can help that area progress, that'd be great.
Yes. Well, it's a beautiful area.
Hey Jim, sorry I wasn't there when we first introduced, but you read something about what the university really offers to all the students. That's one. A is the education that you get. Second is a degree, like the recognition of the education you got, and third is the experience. So, and in this world, education is basically free if you just wanted to teach yourself. There are multiple YouTube videos and all of that. Not as good as a professional teacher, but not as expensive as a university too. So education is basically free in terms of if you are willing to learn something. And universities are not giving the experience anymore because everything is online. And do you think, what's the future? If the university is only offering a degree and then more of the employers are increasingly saying, hey, if you want to know how to work, then if you can work these skills, then we don't even need a degree.
Well, there's one thing you haven't mentioned, and that is social networking while you're in college. And
yeah, that's what I meant by the experience part. like the talking
Okay.
teachers, friends,
Okay.
the college experience, you make friends and all of that.
And that's all often very important in a career path.
Mm-hmm.
I still have friends from when I was in school, and I hate to admit how long ago that was. But that's a really important thing. And I think you do miss out on something by having it all digital. You really do. It is simply not the same, as you said, the same experience. Yes, you can learn some technical things online pretty well, maybe as well as in the classroom, but the kind of subtle things and discussion, that's harder digitally, even in a well-designed online course.
Yeah, and I've also been reading about the private universities whose tuition is like, north of $50,000 a year, and they're doing everything online, and they're still charging north of that. And then does that make sense? Like, are these students entitled for a discount?
Yeah. Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore is probably the most famous on that, and they just lowered their tuition by 10%, but they were in the $50,000 to $60,000 range. USC is up there in that range, and they're going all digital. One of the surprising things to a lot of people is teaching online is not really cheaper than doing it face to face. It is, despite the fact that we use a lot of technology doing that, it is very labor intensive. And it is just not cheaper to produce. So universities are going to be between a rock and a hard place, with people thinking, well, the computers are doing all the work, we should be charged less. Well, the expenses go up. You have to have a lot more equipment, you have to have a lot more software, and the time it takes for an instructor to really prepare and to do a good job online goes up. It doesn't go down.
Don't the universities have like an IT person that is available or monitoring every class to help?
I wish every class. I doubt that occurs even at Harvard or Yale or MIT. Every university has a staff. At NMSU, it is larger than just one person. But I'll give you an example. NMSU that I know better, we have about 650 faculty members. We do not have 650 tech people to follow us around. There are people you can call, but that effort is going to have to expand. They're going to be dealing with a lot more stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it seems logical to assume that if we're doing more online learning, that universities would be expanding their IT department, but
sure,
that's just my assumption.
They need to, and you also have to provide training for faculty to be able to do this. It's a different deal to confront a computer screen and a lot of students than it is to walk into a classroom where you get absolutely instant feedback from the students. That's one thing I like about teaching. The feedback is instantaneous. You can tell when students are getting it or not getting it. That's not as easy online. So what he's brought up is that's the $1 million question for higher ed, or many billion-dollar question for higher ed. What is it that we're offering? People have been talking about the reform of higher education for at least a half a century. We're still doing higher ed in large part the same way we were doing it a century ago. What does it mean to restructure and change higher education? Those are incredibly complex topics.
Feels like it's going to happen.
Facebook Facebook picture of Ray and your son, like first day of first grade, looking at a computer screen. Now,
Yeah.
I mean, I really didn't feel as though he should not have been doing that. He should be going out playing with his friends. That's what I think. But I mean, if this becomes the norm and you learn online, you work online, like almost if everything is online, at one point you might think that's the norm and see nothing wrong with it. I don't know what's that going to be.
Yeah.
Kids have got to have social interaction. That's an important part of their education.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing because I have two kids and one has been doing great without social interaction, but the other one, I mean, he's a mess and he needs that social interaction and it's definitely been hard on him. But you know, I mean, the good thing is that the technology aspect of it hasn't been difficult for them at all. They've
Right.
They've started, they're off and running and they're doing great as far as the actual learning part goes. So that makes me happy. But yeah, I'm curious what this means for education going forward. You know, is this a major turning point? We talk when we talk about going back to work and going back to normal. We're starting to realize that there is no going back, that this is the new normal. And I can't help but wonder what the new normal looks like for education, whether it's higher ed or elementary education.
Absolutely. And it's not just education. Work from home, if that really sticks around, is going to transform the economy. And you are absolutely correct. There is no going back. I get the question, when are we going to have a pre-COVID economy? All the time. And what I tell people is we are never going to have a pre-COVID economy. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
Consumers have changed. Work habits have changed. Commuting patterns have changed. Business travel has changed.
Yeah, definitely. I'm just trying to be optimistic and I'm kind of excited to see what the new normal is. I mean, I'll be more excited when I'm not stuck at home with the kids all the time, but the curious part of my nature, I'm actually interested to see what comes out of this. No one wanted it, no one expected it, but it's amazing to me to see how our society is onto a major change in every facet.
Absolutely. I generally drive 25,000 miles a year, and I haven't had 2 tanks of gas since March. I don't go to conferences, and yes, you can have Zoom conferences, even large ones, but the interaction that you get by being there physically, it's different. It's a lot different. And maybe I just haven't adapted to it yet, but I hear the same thing from a lot of my colleagues and friends. We're all anxious to get on the road again.
Yeah. No, I mean, you're right. I can't even imagine. Like, I miss the work, not just the work interaction, but I try to turn every work situation into more than just work. And so, there's people that I come across on a daily basis or on a monthly basis. And it's always, I try to make that effort to engage with them and see how they're doing, not just in work, but in their personal life. And
right. And
I haven't had that because in a Zoom meeting with tons of other people, you don't want to just blurt something out.
and working at a university, it's not just my colleagues that over the years you get to know the buildings and grounds people, you get to know the janitors and the people who take care of the buildings, and that's gone. Whatever comes out of this, we've got to find a way to have continued social interaction, or we just we'll all go crazy.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, I think that about wraps it up for us.
Okay.
You
better take care of your kids. I've enjoyed it.
So don't forget to check us out at Beaver, that's bber.unm.edu, or on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn under @UNMBeaver. Thanks again for listening. Take care.